happening. I have to say that I'm really happy to chair this session, some of it for very selfish reasons, because I found Sara has been grappling with many of the same questions that has kind of intrigued me throughout much of my writing life. And I think at the core of this is how to talk, the question of language and environment, how to talk about life in India when your training is often Western, when there's a Western language in play. And Sara has dealt with this question between Hindi and English, and I have dealt with the same question with respect to Bengali and English, and I have decided to write in English, she has decided to write in Hindi, but I found that fascinating that many of the questions we've asked are very similar. And is her essay on not writing, and that's very, very revealing, especially in the place of a symposium called Bus Tradition, which I've taught in my class. She brings up this question about how, which is also part of her prize-winning book, Raw Umber, that I've really, very similar questions. You know, how do you write, how do you evoke a local life, but through a lens of Western craft and English language? Questions which I think writers since Raja Rao have been asking, and it's fascinating that even writers who write in Hindi and other local Indian languages have been asking the same questions, because, you know, I think we live in this continuum between languages and culture. So even when you write in one language, you're not free of the other language. You know, I've found that very much. I write in English, but people have said I write Bangla novels in English. And then in the same thing, in Sara's case, the question of Western craft and language keeps playing in. So there are a lot of fascinating questions here. She also talks about what it means to be a Hindi writer in North India, a woman writer. Like, to what degree you are excluded from things like street conversations? Like, how easy is it to access it? Like, can you really hear things? I know some of us, Tim has been running this great experiment of overhearing conversations at the IIC, that, you know, this is fascinating. You sit in breakfast table and things that you hear, and there's a whole India, hopefully doesn't go back to England thinking this is the only India that exists. But this is exactly what writers do. We eavesdrop, we love gossip. We are more interested in the conversation in the next table than on the table, our table. Suddenly everybody is quiet because everybody's trying to listen to the conversation next door. I tell my workshop students, let's just be quiet. Let's listen to when I take them out for the dhaba. And this is exactly what Sara is talking about, that, you know, how do you do that when you're a woman writer? When your access to public spaces is not the same as a man? And these are really fascinating questions, really fascinating questions. It really made me think when I was reading that essay and I was discussing it with my students. And also that, you know, that also makes you a very sensitive writer of the private domain, of the domestic space. And I would remember, I think her father, the writer and critic Sripat Rai, telling her, you can be the Catherine Mansfield in Hindi. And that immediately got my attention, because Catherine Mansfield is a writer I greatly admire. I really enjoyed, I've written about her. The evocation on the banality of life is fascinating with Mansfield, the tenderness with which she does it. So there's so many questions which I find so resonant with Sara's writing, the questions she's taught. And I think she really brings it alive. And another book which has really been useful for me, you know, again in my own reading and writing, is Blue is Like Blue. That is you know, the short story collection that she translated. And it's quite fascinating how, you know, there's so many things, you know, about craft. You know, Vinod Kumar Shukla is a writer who wasn't known to the English-speaking world for the longest time, but for this translation, I think, you know, we know, just the way Naiyer Masud, another writer whom I think Hindi readers know for the longest time, but I think it was Sara who translated her and gave into prominence, and then Shisha Ghat appeared in the Picador book edited by Amit Chaudhary. So I think many of us have come to know, and it's quite amazing. This is exactly what literary activism is about: creating an archive, finding new archives, bringing them to a public, and creating new readerships. And fascinatingly, how to talk about craft and the writing process, not as an academic, but as a writer. Reflection, but on writerly terms. Reflection not as a disembodied process, but reflection as a very internal process, as a cannibalistic process, if I might cannibalize Tim's languages. So I think those questions have been so satisfying to me, so thrilling to me. So I'm really honored to have continue this conversation and hear what Sara has to say about Naiyer Masud. Over to you.
Can I shut this? Thank you, Saikat. I was promised a shock, but I get kindness and generosity instead, so what do I do about that? Thank you also, Amit, for asking me to this very august gathering. I mean, even though it's supposed to be bust, but it seems to be full of very interesting and very sort of knowledgeable, erudite people. I'm afraid I'm not so erudite. And today I'll be speaking about the Urdu writer Naiyer Masud, as Saikat has already said. But first of all, I must say that Naiyer Masud writes in Urdu, which is also a bust language, because it is increasingly less visible in my hometown of Allahabad, where the road signs used to be in 3 languages, English, Hindi, and Urdu. I find that the Urdu has now been replaced by Bangla. I love Bangla. My father couldn't move a step without Bangla. I've grown up with Rabindra Sangit. But I do not want Urdu replaced by Bangla. So, and this is obviously a political moment, so what does one do about that? And increasingly, the language has been vanishing from our lives, as have Muslims been vanishing from our lives, as have Muslim writers been vanishing from our lives. So this, I'd like to say that here. And, this is with my vague terror of public speaking, which has dogged me into my old age. I must say that I'm bust as well. So this is going to be about a bust writer, Naiyer Masud, which, I mean, I'll explain why I call him bust. Writing in a bust language and being spoken about by another bust writer. So how much more bust can you get than that? So, I should start with saying that I've met Naiyer Masud. I met him about 20 years ago, a very long time ago, on one of his 2 trips to Delhi, because he came here to collect an award. I had nominated him. I did not translate that story, Saikat. Shisha Ghat was nominated by me. I did not translate it. So he got an award for that story, and he came to Delhi for that. I met him for the first time then. And then, say about 5 or 7 years later, I was foolish enough to think that I could translate him. And HarperCollins thought that I might actually be able to do it. So they made up a contract. And they said, please go and get it signed, and then we can carry on with this project. So I went to Lucknow, to Adabistan, which is displayed. Have I shut this and it's gone? Sorry about that. How do I get it back? So that's the house. And I'll be talking about this house also in my little essay that I've written on him. So this is where I visited him. He was already quite old and quite sick. And when I told him about this translation and I showed him the contract, he said, you just fill up whatever you like. I'll sign it. So I said, okay. I mean, but obviously that didn't get signed, didn't get written. I didn't translate it, so the book never happened. So, but that's how I met him for the second time. And I've been fascinated with his work for a very long time. So I'm glad, Amit, that I've been given this chance to speak about him. So I think I'll just get into it right away. And I hope, I can just read it. So it's called Finding a Form, the Fiction of Naiyer Masud. Reading the stories of the Urdu writer Naiyer Masud, one soon begins to feel a certain disquiet. The places described in them, narrow dark passageways and half-open doors, twisting by lanes, courtyards with their arches and niches, empty rooms filled with shadows, dusty trees overhanging unused wells, all seem very familiar. You've seen them somewhere. I've got the wrong glasses on, sorry. Yeah. So they all seem very familiar. You've seen them somewhere. They lie just at the edge of your consciousness. You try to remember, but they evade memory. The people seem familiar too, mysterious visitors who soundlessly appear one day in the house next door without being seen coming, with their half smiles and silent movements. You know them. The feeling of being unsettled deepens when you begin to suspect that the world of the stories uncannily reflects the one that is already inside you. It's as if someone were quietly showing you scenes from your own mind. It is disorienting, for notwithstanding the intimacy that the reader feels with the stories, there's that odd sensation of not being able to place them. Something is askew. Always in sight, yet always elusive, the stories are like mirages. They shimmer and seduce, leading the reader into a maze where you go round in circles, searching for meaning, but the text carries no familiar pegs of causality. The logical sequence of beginning, middle, and end are missing. The elliptical, fragmentary structure of the narrative blurs the line between the real and the imagined. The stories seem to have no purpose. They are just simply, quietly there. Muhammad Umar Memon, Masud's translator, has called them stories that are preoccupied with being rather than with meaning. It is this quality of the stories that led Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, the astute Urdu critic, novelist, and closest friend of Naiyer Masud, to say about them that they go nowhere, they are like dreams, clear as glass, yet profoundly mysterious. The stories create subliminal connections with the reader that are as difficult to put a finger on as the stories themselves. They are to be read with the senses, and it is at a sensory level that they can be understood. Though understood is not the word that comes to mind when talking about Naiyer Masud. The stories are experienced at a level that is not quite cerebral. Naiyer Masud was born in Lucknow in 1936 and till his death in 2017 continued to live in Adabistan, which means the home of literature. And you can see it written on that, it's in Urdu. The name is written on top of the house. So this was a haveli that was bought by his father, Sayyid Masood Hassan Rizvi Adib, in Turiaganj or Victoriaganj in the old city. His father had the old haveli redesigned by the formerly untrained but imaginative architect, Aga Mir Hussain. Masood has a detailed description of the house in his essay called Adabistan, published in the Karachi-based journal Aaj, about how, as a boy, he watched the structure take shape, a whitewashed house with balconies and balustrades, rather a Gothic-inspired fantasy with arches and swirls in the shape of crescent moons, towers on either side of the facade, and pillars on which rest round concrete blocks. This is the house Masood lived in all his life. He rarely left Lucknow, disliked travel and social chit-chat. He found himself completely unable to write outside Adabistan. This is the only place I can write, he said. I have never written anything outside of my home, and the house crops up frequently in his stories with its neem trees, its courtyard, and its dark interiors. I must say here that when I was trying to search for his stories, for his collections, I could find them nowhere. The Urdu versions were just nowhere around to be bought or borrowed or whatever. So, and he didn't have them either. He didn't possess a single copy of his books. So it was his son who was around at the time, and somehow he had photocopies, and he gave them those photocopies, which I still have to this day. And that's the only Masood I have. And now I've acquired some other collections as well. And of course, now he's widely available in English and in other languages, Spanish, I think, also, and Swedish, and some other languages. He's been translated now into many languages. So at that point, there was nothing. So, well, unconcerned with plot and linear development, Masood's fictions go in search of their form. They do not quite fall in the genre of the conventional story. Or one might say, they extend the boundaries of the form. By his own admission, he never felt the restlessness to write that comes upon most writers, and it took him several months to finish a story. He'd write the first sentence to be followed by the second only after 20 days had gone by, nor did he have a daily routine of writing. Itre Kafur, his favorite, took him a year to write. Naiyer Masud published 4 collections of short stories titled Simia, which means the occult, in 1984, Itre Kafur, which is Essence of Camphor, 1990, Taus Chaman Ki Maina, the Maina from Peacock Garden, 1998, and Ganjefa, Card Game. He also translated Kafka, with whom he has an affinity, perhaps because, like Kafka, in the density of his prose, he has an inclination to opacity, though each sentence is clear as glass. He had not read Kafka when he started writing stories, he said in an interview, but Kafka and Poe were writers he thought he could learn from. Masood's Kafka translations appeared in 1978 in the collection Kafka Ke Afsane, and his translation from Persian to Urdu of Mirza Fateh Ali's Hakim Nabatat in 1967, followed by the collection Farsi Kahaniya in 2002. Masood's parents belonged to families of Hakims, practitioners of Unani medicine, but his father left the family occupation to become an Urdu and Persian scholar with a considerable library of academic books. Unsurprisingly, there were no books for children. Naiyer read whatever he could lay his hands on. By the age of 5, he says, he had read the canonical work of Urdu literary historiography, Ab-e-Hayat, by Muhammad Hussain Azad, and his Darbar-e-Akbari about the achievements of Mughal Emperor Akbar by the time he was 10. He had written a few early stories, but later devoted himself to research in Urdu and Persian, in both of which he acquired a PhD. He taught Persian at Lucknow University from 1967 till he retired in 1996. In addition to fiction, he published in 1973 a treatise on Ghalib with the title Tabir-e-Ghalib, and in 2011, a biography of Mir Anis, the master of Marsiya, or elegiac poem, who was born in Lucknow. Masood resumed writing relatively late in life. He wrote to Memon, his translator at the University of Wisconsin, that he was interested in calligraphy, painting, and music, and that he could also manage minor repair jobs around the house, which have to do with plumbing, masonry, electrical work, and carpentry. But I did learn the art of bookbinding formally, he says. My true occupation, at any rate, is reading and, occasionally, writing. Despite the reference to occasionally writing, he wrote at least 33 stories, and his knowledge of masonry, carpentry, and bookbinding informs some of them. In Essence of Camphor, the narrator, who incidentally seems to be the same in most of the stories, and is perhaps the author himself, is seen practicing the difficult art of perfume making. Camphor is the basic ingredient of all the perfumes, but even a vivid description of the process by which the perfume is made does not bring the reader any clarity about it. There could be a parallel here with Masood's subtle art of telling a story. This is how, in Muazzam Sheikh and Elizabeth Bell's translation, he describes the process of making perfume using an extract of camphor as a base. Start quote. In my extract, however, one does not smell camphor or any other fragrance. It is a colorless solution inside a white, square-bottomed china jar. No fragrance of any kind wafts through the jar's narrow opening when the round lid is removed. Attempting to smell it, one feels a vacant forlornness, and the next time round, breathing it in more deeply, one detects something in that forlornness. At least that's what I feel. I cannot say what others feel, since no one has ever smelt that extract in its purest form, apart from me. It is true that when I prepare an essence with this foundation, those who inhale it think there is something else underneath the expected fragrance. Obviously, they cannot recognize it, for there is no fragrance at all in my extract of camphor. End quote. The perfume is essentially indefinable. It denies the expectation of something underneath the camphor fragrance, and one who smells it feels only a vacant forlornness. If a parallel may be drawn between perfume making and writing fiction, one notices that Masud's stories too belie the expectation of a resolution at the end. He said that he disliked dramatic endings and had edited out the last sentence in many stories if they seemed to have too forceful an ending. One might recall Bolaño, a self-proclaimed bust writer, whose stories for their indefinite endings have been referred to as being governed by a poetics of inconclusiveness. It could be added that Bolaño's stories have a conclusive inconclusiveness. The narrative is often simply cut short. Masud's stories too do not have definite endings. Rather, they fade away, vanishing like a wisp of smoke, or in fact, like the extract of camphor that wafts away from the jar in which the perfume is being made. Leaving a vacant forlornness, this vacant forlornness can be taken as the invisible center of the story, if one can be so reckless as to assign it a center. Essence of Camphor is about the friendship of the narrator with Mahrukh Sultan, a girl with an unnamed medical condition, who one day moves into the neighboring house with her family. But it is also about making things, about creating. And from the opening scene with the narrator making perfume, the story quickly goes off at a tangent to reveal that he has been fond of making sundry items out of ill-assorted pieces of things picked up here and there, that he stores under his bed, quote, pieces of wood, snippets of gaily colored cloth, scraps of tin, metal wire, even fruit pits. For much of the story, he is taken with the idea of making what he calls a kafuri sparrow, perhaps because the white bird and its scent remind him of camphor. It is camphor that forms the tenuous link between perfume making and the making of the bird, which then transforms into a real bird, and the bird leads to a tree. As in dreams, one object changes into another. Sounds transform too. What the narrator thinks is a fluttering of the bird's wings in the tree becomes the sound of quiet rain. This is how Masud describes the scene with the tree and the bird that the narrator sees. Now, quote again. It was metamorphosing before my eyes. The raindrops were tracing green lines on the fuzzy leaves as they washed away the dust, and the wilted leaves were slowly regaining their freshness. Suddenly, the rain began to fall more heavily, and I turned toward the door in the wall. The faint smell of earth rose to my nostrils. Then the sound of a rapid fluttering met my ears. I turned again to look back at the tree. The bird was fluttering about in a fixed spot just above it. As its swiftly flapping wings scattered fat drops of water, the bird appeared as if enveloped in a white fog. On all sides of this trembling tuft of fog, the incessant rain drew white strings from sky to earth. This is a sensory experience in which eyes, ears, and nose are simultaneously involved, and the narrator's experience is similarly registered by the reader. It seems possible to touch the wilted leaves and feel the trembling tuft of fog. The smell of camphor pursues the narrator throughout the story, and the forsaken fragrance is there again, right at the end, when Mahrukh Sultan dies and the narrator feels an immense forlornness. The forlornness also manifests in a feeling of absence, a sense of something missing, which is happening beneath the surface. This comes about because of the author's technique of leaving out large parts of the narrative, even after the whole thing has been worked out in great detail. The page becomes a palimpsest in which the unwritten, or what has been written and then erased, is perceptible to the reader. There is a deliberate nurturing of absence by the excision of sizable chunks of the narrative and the withholding of clarity as a literary device. In an interview, Masud has said, "What if one constructed the whole story but didn't narrate the whole of it? Not even hint at some of it. Would it carry over to the reader's mind, however dimly? I soon realized that this was possible." End of quote. His world, replete with trees, birds, and details of houses with the objects in them. There are insignias and sacred stones, ancient heirlooms with unclear histories that are handed down in families. All seem to belong not to this world, but to a parallel one that exists alongside. The straightforwardness of his prose could tempt imitation, but the simplicity of the text is deceptive. No one can be like him. He is, as Mayman says, sui generis. His is an absent tradition, one might say. So intent is he on erasing identifiable markers. Like Kafka, he listens, not to tradition, but to language. His ears keening to hear the extraneous word, the unnecessary punctuation mark that can break the back of a sentence. He reads the work of other writers for their shortcomings rather than their strengths, to learn how not to write. Prose, he has said, has a power of its own which can be written into it. You just have to work hard at it and be attentive. So what is it that he pays attention to? To what does he listen? I've tried not to write a single obscure sentence, he says, and makes it clear that he stays away both from metaphors and from idioms. He writes with simplicity and directness, and it is by listening to language that the clarity of his prose is achieved. Yet, the clarity itself is misleading. His world is meticulous in its detail, but the details don't sharpen the images, they blur them instead. There appears to be a pact between specificity and haziness, and this lies at the heart of the stories. There is a tension between what is seen and what is felt to be present, even when it is not seen, and the tension is never resolved. The stories have no closure. Most of them are set in what feels like a familiar local kasbah, but nowhere is the location of this unnamed settlement mentioned. Since Masud lived in Lucknow, the inference can be drawn that this is where the stories are set. There is also, above doorways, the telltale motif of twin fish, the royal insignia of Awadh. But apart from one or two exceptions where Lucknow is mentioned, the story Ganjefa comes to mind. There is a haziness about the locale that goes against the grain of precision in the prose. Only after a few readings does one realize that these settings exist nowhere except in the hermetic space of the writer's mind. The bazaars and the gateways, the wells, arches and columns, the crumbling stone facades of school buildings and shops that populate Masud's stories come from his past, and it is the past that fuels his fiction, giving to it its melancholy aura. Arches affect me personally, he says. I find them very evocative. The mere sight of an arch touches off a whole train of thought in me. I won't call it a symbol. An arch is not a symbol of anything, nothing at all, but it never fails to exert a hypnotic pull. Countless stories lurk in an arch, and so they do, end of quote. There are bunches of faceless relatives and neighbors who speak indistinctly or in whispers. Sounds are often muffled, making it hard for the narrator to hear. The speech, inaudible in the story, reaches the reader. You make the vaguest suggestion, Masud has said, and the reader's imagination takes over. The first story that he published, Nusrat, was written in 1971 when he returned to fiction after spending 5 or 6 years writing his PhD thesis in Persian. Too diffident to send the story in his own name to Shabkhun, and here again, this is the bus tradition working. Too diffident to send the story in his own name to Shabkhun, the journal edited by Shamsul Rahman Farooqi, he passed it off as his translation of a Persian story. The name he sent it under was Roya Nasij, which in Persian means fabric woven in dreams. And in fact, the story was a complete and coherent dream that he had written down. Later translated by Mayman as The Woman in Black, it is dreamlike, featuring a bad woman, who is never named, and in a separate thread of action, there is Nusrat, one of the few characters in his fiction that do have a name. The narrator finds her sitting under a tree while she waits for an old surgeon to attend to her feet that have been crushed in an accident. With the inexplicability of dreams, her feet get cured with no scars remaining and then are again misshapen at the end of the story. A kind of oblique, tormented eroticism pervades the narrator's interaction with her. This, in Maimon's translation, is the last glimpse, somehow visually reminiscent of a painting by Gustav Klimt that the narrator gets of her. Start quote. My eyes fell on her. Her features were not visible. I couldn't understand why this was so. I leaned forward and took a closer look. Dry yellow leaves covered her face like a veil. I wanted to remove the leaves from her face, but saw that they were held together by cobwebs, and my hand stopped halfway. End of quote. It is a distinctive, slightly out of focus perspective, a slanting angle from which the writer approaches old houses and the people that live in them, mysterious families whom the narrator often does not know. In Tehweel, which means transference, there is a shop resembling the usual corner shop, and this shop is always run by one Noroz who is succeeded by others of the same name, as if it were a royal title. The current Noroz always goes mad, and he is replaced by another Noroz who takes charge of the shop till he too goes mad. And the next Noroz, who will eventually also go mad, takes his place. Two little girls materialize from nowhere in the shop. They look exactly the same, have strange eyes, and there is something eerie about the way they move and try to speak. The weirdest of situations are presented in completely unembellished language, with no exclamation marks or other signifiers. All of this adds up to create a sense of disjunction. The familiar is stripped of familiarity. In Essence of Camphor, there's something odd about the family, neighbors of the narrator, described in utterly plain language in Sheikh and Bell's translation. They move into the house, and the quote goes, "There were 6 or 7 people who had sat for the most part in silence with their heads bowed. The women of the house would get up to do some work, then return to their place and sit with their heads down. The men would return from the work, go quietly to their rooms, re-emerge after changing their clothes, and sit with their heads down. A girl would ask another something, be answered, and then both would fall silent and lower their heads. All of them seemed to be engulfed in a fog." The description has the visual quality of a dream seen through a fog that renders the characters barely visible. In other stories too, the characters move slowly through indistinct landscapes, and the scenes in their silent, slow austerity recall the cinematic frames from a Theo Angelopoulos film. He's a prominent exponent of slow film, so they recall that. On the shifting sands of the Masudian world, time too is a slippery entity. Ojhal, which means invisible, translated as obscure domains of fear and desire by M.U. Maimon, opens with the sentence, "We kept looking at each other for the longest time ever." We are not told who these characters are or how long was the longest time ever. But the story that begins with an amorous encounter moves on, with the narrator taking up the singular profession of inspecting houses. Soon he is experienced enough to tell, just by looking at a house, not only how old it is, but also the speed with which time has passed in it. In fact, time passes at a speed different inside a house from the speed outside it. And it also changes from one house to the next. It seems to run at a faster pace in the bazaar. There is a constant compression and expansion of time. In this refusal to stick to the realistic notion of time, Masud is perhaps creatively assimilating elements of the dastan, which is the oldest form of storytelling in Urdu. Action unfolds in all sorts of ways in the dastan. The supernatural and the mystical are its ingredients, as are the fable, folklore, magic, and alchemy. There is little regard for the boundaries of what is possible, logical, or real. In his lecture on exactitude in literature in 6 memos for the next millennium, Calvino speaks about the passion of the 19th century poet Giacomo Leopardi for savoring the beauty of the vague and indefinite. Citing a passage by Leopardi, Calvino enumerates the conditions that must exist before one can do this. Now this is a quote. What he requires is a highly exact and meticulous attention to the composition of each image, to the minute definition of details, to the choice of objects, to the lighting and the atmosphere, all in order to attain the desired degree of vagueness. Quote end. This holds true for Masud, who pays close attention to minutiae in building up a scene. The observation of detail adds up to a visual emphasis in the stories, but this is an illusion that is quickly destroyed. After laying out a scene in particular detail, a haze is deliberately created to undermine that depiction. So he's kind of canceling out, as he goes forward, he cancels out what he's just written. So things seen in the murky light turn into something quite different on sustained looking. In Nudba, which means lamentation, there are far-flung lands where the wastelanders live. The narrator has spent his life in fruitless diversions. This is fruitless is in commas. And one of these is to wander about, visiting small and scattered communities that are slowly dying out. In one such community, he becomes acquainted with their ritual of congregational lament at the deaths that seem to happen rather frequently. People from these wasteland communities visit him when he's back home. Nearby shopkeepers point him to where they are, the people who have come. So now this is a quote. Without saying a word, they pointed at the nameless dirt path which sloped down towards the north, its mouth nearly blocked off by the bazaar's encroaching garbage dump. I looked where they pointed. At first glance, it appeared as though the area beyond the dump was dotted all over with small garbage heaps, but a second glance revealed them to be a group of people who sat crouching on the ground. End quote. The transformation of garbage heaps into people is possible only because of the vagueness carefully cultivated by Masud. Quite apart from the dusky light that pervades the description of scenes, there are other impediments to sight. People are engulfed in fog, but sometimes it is raining and water fills the eyes, preventing seeing. Water is also replaced by sand, as in Sultan Muzaffar's chronicler of events. Even a group of laughing and shouting girls is described in Essence of Camphor as a darkness of many colors that fills the room. There is a further blurring of perspective in the same story, and the narrator's house seems at once too close and too far. How does one approach a writer who conceals, withholds, erases, mystifies, and misleads, yet writes with something like mathematical precision and what can be called visual poetry? Paradoxically, the stories are set in what seems to be an eternal past, and yet they never do become the past. It's as if everything remains in abeyance, it doesn't pass. No closure is possible in the illusory nature of things. Everything that has existed will always exist. Nothing fades away, nothing dies, says Angelo Paulos. The maze of Masud's world, then, is entered for its own sake. The reader breathes in the rarefied, camphor-scented air and emerges feeling replenished. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. I do feel like I have the sensation of waking from some kind of a dream while I listen to it, and I have this desperate need to smell camphor. And of course, as you said, it's something which doesn't have a smell. I mean, camphor does have a smell, but the way it's described here, it's almost that smelllessness. And that longing tells me how much I got into your talk as well as Masud's stories through it. And that expression, forlorn, the forlorn is such a lovely word. I mean, I was reminded it's such a beautiful word. It sort of curls against itself. And that expression, vacant forlornness, it's such a beautiful phrase. And, I think it really, I wanted to say that camphor is kind of a metaphor for this fiction, but I don't think it's a metaphor. It's actually the fiction. It is part of it. It's continuous with it. Metaphor implies a kind of a imagination of things, but it's so much viscerally in the story that I was really immersed in it. Even when you said things like settings, the settings he talks about don't actually exist. So there's this kind of curious, I could quite see why the Kafka is the existential, not that sense of, and that description, I think it was by Faruqi, that it's clear as glass and yet profoundly mysterious. That oxymoron clearly came alive, that it's really clear physically and at the same time profoundly mysterious. There's so many things that really struck me. His evocation of arches, I think that is what a writerly imagination is really about, that to be struck by the physical and yet the physical not necessarily be symbolic of anything. Can you be really struck by something and it just stay there? Arches are just evocative, but they don't evoke anything, but they just sort of strike me. So there's so much going on, how, or the fact that he reads others to see their flaws. That's a fantastic, really innovative way of reading. What not to do. So this celebration of negativity is so beautifully brought out, I think, in his fiction, as well as in your evocation of his writing. So I was really delighted. So I'm sure people have things to say. It's not going to be, nothing, but I would love to hear your intervention since it's nothingness. So, questions?
Yeah, I think so. I'm audible. Yeah, thank you for that wonderful talk. I was thinking about this, pact between haziness and specificity that you talked about, and in that regard, I was thinking how this pact is always, in some ways, involved when you are writing about the familiar. And I was also thinking, since you have also worked on Vinod Kumar Shukla and other writers, for instance, who come from this, what we might call bust traditions. I'm thinking of Arun Kolatkar. I'm also thinking here of Amit, who is sitting here, where this pact of specificity and haziness, where sometimes specificity is sought after doggedly, but it always gives out this aesthetic which produces wonder, which doesn't produce clarity, but always, as Saikat was talking about, this sense where, the image doesn't, or the writing doesn't take you to some symbolic meaning. It just leaves you with this feeling which doesn't make sense to you at all. So I was sorry for that, complex question, but what I'm trying to ask is, if you have thought of Masud's work in some ways also in relationship to Vinod Kumar Shukla and this idea of the bust writer. So, yeah.
One similarity I think that Masud and Shukla share, and as do other writers in Hindi and Urdu, is that, very few people read them. They belong automatically to the bust tradition. This I can say of the languages in India, because most of the people do not know about them. I mean, quite a few of them are not translated really, so this is part of an argument that Amit also presents in the mission statement of this seminar. So basically, writers in the languages are bust writers, by definition, I think. And Shukla and Masud, also because they are both quite extraordinary in their own ways. There's no similarity as such between the two writers, because Masud's world is a kind of, sort of, world that he has arrived at by imagining it and observing the details around him. Whereas in Shukla, the world is extraordinary. The world that he sees around him is extraordinary. I mean, it's just everyday things that he's looking at, everyday events that he's coming upon, and very small things. It takes nothing to make a story, really, for him. And for instance, when he, the title of his books are also quite interesting in that respect. Like one of them is called Khilega to Dekhenge, which when it flowers, we will see when it flowers. So it's basically he's observing things, and he's not trying to go after any theme as such. He's not writing about anything. He's waiting for the process to come upon him, and he will see what happens at the end of it. So that way, I suppose, that could be a very distant kind of similarity with Masud, but otherwise their worlds are totally different, worlds apart, I would say. So does that answer your question?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sara. That was wonderful to hear. The image you've put up there is also so beautiful and evocative. The word that kept coming back to my mind, and in fact has been there in my mind ever since I have read Masud and admired him, is the word magic. And I was wondering whether, since we are talking about boom and bust, we have been talking about it since yesterday, whether we could coin a phrase, magical realism, to contrast with which is of the bust tradition, to contrast with the magic realism of the boom. Because there is something magical in the realism, the everyday. You've been saying this again and again throughout your paper. You said it in response to the last question, the ordinary, the everyday, the detail, the manner in which, but when you read, I mean, for me, when I first read Masud, there is something magical. It's like the magical mystery tour. It is mysterious as well, of course. It is a form of realism. It is a form of realism. This is a sort of magical realism, in contrast to almost the violence of magic realism, where a snake turns into. Andres gave us many examples yesterday from 100 Years of Solitude. I'm not sure there's a question there. It's just that I wanted you to well, you've already have, but to speculate further on, yes, you've spoken about the manner in which he brings these details into the stories to create this blurring of vision, which transforms into sort of dreamlike situations. But whether we could actually describe it as a realism that is magical and mysterious at the same time. Just thoughts in relation to the bust and boom that we've been talking about since yesterday.
Well, he himself would not have called himself magical. I mean, he was so...
the
he
realism
kind of
for us.
disliked these words for magical, and, he was very he just devoted to the word, the meticulous noting down of things and words. And partly, I think, this impression of magical, the magic in his stories could also be because the terrain is so unfamiliar. I mean, we don't know what happens. If you go to, in fact, when I go sometimes to a very kind of poor Muslim neighborhood, you often see those things. You see those crowded sort of lanes, you see narrow sort of openings, you see half-open doors, all those things are there. There are wells quite often, which are sort of trees hanging over them. So these are things that you have seen. So the reality that he writes down is that reality, and which may be unfamiliar to a lot of us, maybe. So half of that, I think, is the magic from his writing comes from that, maybe.
Thank you. I guess I'm going to repeat what others have said. I think by magic maybe she means a kind of hypnosis, but the hypnosis created by not magic as the Latin American magic realists sort of introduced an element of the obviously miraculous to the text. While here there's nothing obvious. There's no obviously miraculous transformation. We are being hypnotized by the real. I just want to say a little bit about Naiyer Masud, and then ask you a question about my sort of own just indulging myself over here, really, maybe taking advantage of the fact that I organized the symposium. When this publisher called the New Press from New York, it used to be one of the best independent publishers in America, published, I think it was a collection called Essence of Camphor. I presume they published his selected stories with the title Essence of Camphor. And that was his first sort of appearance in English. And they sent me the book for a blurb. And so I've been looking for that blurb. And I see that they've only quoted the most banal bit of it, the most extraordinary fictional voice to have emerged in world literature this decade.
No, there's this another one that is your quote, which is used very often. I think it's been used by Maiman also, calm and passionate.
Yes, that's the one I wanted to get to.
Yeah.
So this I mean they use the whole quote in the book, but here in the website it's only this bit.
No, it's only that.
It's only that bit. I was looking for it while listening to you. I hope you didn't think I was WhatsApping or anything. I was looking for this. So at that I was saying that I think because that was a year of Booker Prizes and Indian wins, etc. All of that was part of the celebration. And here I received this book. I didn't know about this person, and immediately struck by this writer and what he was doing. And that made me call him for the same endorsement, a passionate but calm realist of the strange.
Yes.
A passionate but calm realist of the strange. So bringing using words which you also have arrived at with in your essay for having read Masud. I suppose one cannot but address the strange from a form of realism that he's up to. What I'm wondering is the calm. I noticed the calm. What would be the provenance of this calm in terms of an intellectual or artistic provenance, or even a spiritual provenance? I'm just wondering about this quality of calm. And then to repeat the first question about Vinod Kumar Shukla, not so much the stories, but the poems, which are now coming out from literary activism. Again, endorsements. 3 endorsements, including mine, have somehow come up with the word mathematical. Because the poems, again, are absolutely bizarre and absolutely logical. It's just not the logic with which we work from moment to moment every day, but otherwise it is completely logical. There is a mathematical logic and realism going on in Shukla's poems in this in the book, in the poems in the book that's going to come out, and Nirmal Verma. The European stories, where there's no mention, I think, mostly of Europe, and their calmness and their realism. A realism, again, which depends upon not mentioning what a realist would usually mention, that is, I'm in Europe, I'm in Prague, or I'm here or there. None of that is mentioned. It augments a certain idea of realism, which we are unaccustomed with. Again, I'm wondering about how these writers in poetry or in fiction come to this poise, not even poise, calm really, this state of calm, and then arrive at a realism which withholds all the information that realism gives us. And also, the last thing I would say is, thereby also kind of inverts the idea of a writing of exile and a writing that's local. These, which I think are to many writers secretly banal ideas and necessary academic categories maybe, or critical categories. And there was a quote in that handout where Bolaño, I think, is saying that, I don't believe in exile. Even at home, you're at exile.
Yes.
Completely, I've written an essay about this in the way that this happens. Here is a man who lives at home. Now, you've shown us the picture of the home. Completely inverts, as does Nirmal Verma, this idea of writing about home or exile. It's not as if Masud was a writer who wrote about his home, his hometown, his home place. It's not as if Nirmal Verma is saying, I'm a writer in exile, in the way that would usually happen. That would usually happen by saying that I was in Prague and out of sorts. That's not what they're getting at.
No, actually, with Nirmal Verma, I think there are pointers to where he is. He may not mention that I'm in Prague, but I mean, there are pointers that tell you, they're very telltale sort of giveaways about the place that he's
It's odd that he doesn't then dwell on them in any way.
He doesn't dwell on them in any case. I mean, he's just, they come as sort of by the way kind of thing. When he's writing and, you know, it just slips in, the location. I mean, you sort of infer from what he's written about the location, and he doesn't actually mention the places. Nor does Masud, as I said. I mean, we don't know whether he's writing about Lucknow. The places are never named, except in a couple of stories, like Ganjifar is, actually, he does mention Lucknow. And there are a couple of other stories where he mentions Lucknow. And as to the calm that you ask about, I think it's the writer's space inside the head. You know, they are both, like Masud and Kumar Shukla, they never travel, hardly ever travel. They live in one place, they live in the same locale, they see the same things happening day out, day in and day out. So they are kind of very poised, very self-possessed in the location that they are in. And the location is often also in the mind, only in the mind. So they, which is why they get that unhurried feel to the writing also, because the writing sort of very meticulously writing, quietly writing slowly. They are not bothered with, it also sort of leads to the question of why do we write? Why do we write? I mean, I don't think I can answer that question. It's just something that one does. You wake up one day and you want to write. I mean, it's just, you can't live without it. It's like breathing, you know. So it's that kind of feeling that you get from these writers who are not doing it to be known, or who are not, you know. It's just an activity like a cricket would sort of produces that sound from its legs. It's that kind of thing, you know. It's just that you can't live without it. So you're doing it. So you're writing. So maybe that calm comes from a daily repetition of something that you must do. It is a necessary activity.
Fuzail has a, oh, here, and Rita.
This is a foolish question, but because you're possibly one of the few people I know who reads Hindi and Urdu writing, one is envious of your facility with both languages and literatures. I've often wondered at this deep elegiac tone in Urdu writing, whether it's poetry or prose. Why is it so marked? And it's the kind of defining feature of some of the finest writing that one has read in translation. मैं उर्दू पढ़ती नहीं हूँ, so I can't say I've read Urdu. On the other hand, in Hindi literature and in Hindi writing of the same time, you don't find this kind of sorrow, this deep undercurrent of sorrow. Why do you think that is so?
I don't think all of it is very sorrowful, because humor, for instance, is highly developed in Urdu, which is not in Hindi. I think you can hardly find anything humorous in Hindi. But in Urdu, this is highly developed form. So there's that. And it's also, I suppose, what you call the sort of melancholic sort of world is also because it's partly nostalgic, but it's partly nostalgic for a way of being that is maybe rapidly vanishing, you know, something like that. So it just comes into the stories also. So I don't know, it must be that.
Okay. Do we have time for a question, or maybe one? Fuzail also had his hand up, so we have two people who, and there are a couple of, so we have to. And Professor, and Rita has a question. Sorry. So there are a lot of people. So maybe just maybe we can take a couple of responses to questions together, and then Sara can respond to that. So yeah, Rita.
Sara, I was very interested in you as someone who's reading, as someone who's curating, translating, writing, and I'm thinking of the worlds that you occupy, you create in your literary imagination, and the writers you choose to read and talk about. And for want of a better word, it seems to me some of it, this particular Hindi-Urdu literary sphere that you gravitate to, is characterized by a certain kind of modernity. And I was curious to know whether, I'm not saying you're consciously gravitating to it, but कुछ तो है, कुछ उन चीज़ों में है जो बांधे हुए तुम्हें तुम्हारे काम में, and the things that you gravitate to. There is a particular something, and while people have talked about repose and calm and all of that, and we've talked about it in other contexts, but I'm also wondering if you want to think a little bit about whether there is a particular kind of a certain modernity of this sphere which has attracted you, and if it has, what do you think are its characteristics?
Do you want to respond to that, or do you want to also listen to what, and then let's take the other questions and then maybe we can respond together. Yeah.
Thank you for that very interesting paper. I'm actually very intrigued with your title, because when the question of form in Naiyer Masud is coming up, considering the fact that the effect of the question, the focus on form that the Urdu modernist short story, the Jadeed Afsana, really does in the 60s, does have an influence on Masud when he's writing, especially in the first two collections, right? That emphasis on form is almost given up in the third and fourth collections, and he focuses more on the content. So my question with regards to your title is, do you think there is in Masud a possibility of even finding the form, in the form of expressivity or whatever the form that he is trying to look for, because of the effect of the Jadeed Afsana, right? Do you think that Masud wants to actually even find a form, or is this aesthetics essentially one of giving up the search for form?
Shall I answer now? Finding a form is not Masud trying to find a form, it's we trying to find a form, the form that Masud is using. And as far as tradition goes and being influenced by earlier writers, he does not follow any norms as such, no literary norms. The one person that he does say that he was possibly influenced by is an Urdu writer called Ghulam Hussain. And I have not read Ghulam Hussain, so I can't say where the similarity would lie with Masud. But there's certainly no one like him, either before, and it's very unlikely that anyone will be like him after. So the question of tradition as such does not arise with Masud. And this is me trying to find a form that Masud is writing in, and Masud is not doing it. He's writing his own thing, and he doesn't care. He's writing, as he says, he doesn't sort of write he doesn't write every day. He doesn't write, one sentence following another. He writes one and then he forgets about it. Then he comes back to it, say 20 days, 1 month, 6 months later, which is why it takes him so long to finish something. And so he just enjoys writing, but he doesn't try to copy something. I mean, he does say that he learned from Kafka and Poe, but he doesn't mention any other influences on his work. And as far as modernity goes, Rita, I think just the very sort of the style that he uses is modern, and Vinod Kumar Shukla also. I mean, they are writing in something, something that's very new. It's a very plain style, but it's also very new and eccentric. So maybe that's what attracted me to their writing. And I write a very staid prose, so I don't know how you found that, why you would say that I'm because of my own writing, I am attracted to people who are like that. So modernity is only in the style, I would say. Because Vinod Kumar Shukla is also writing about the everyday, but he's writing it in a way that it makes it seem very modern and different. And he's certainly not influenced by any European writer or anyone else, because he's not read them. He doesn't read English very, very easily. So he has not read them. And so he's clearly writing something that's coming from his own thing. And even the poems are so, you could call them weird, and if that word can be used for him, weird and wonderful. So he is completely himself, as with Masud also. Like nobody else can be like them quite, because people have tried to write like Vinod Kumar Shukla in Hindi, and people have tried to write like Naiyer, but nobody, I think, is quite able to get that.
Well, thank you so much. This was great. I think the word staid prose will never be the same again. It's like the smell of camphor. And with that smell, now we can head out to lunch.